his young secretary and thought he had won, but years later, everyone was shocked. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The small apartment smelled of lentils and garlic, the scent clinging to the peeling yellow walls like the memories they had already begun to build. A single ceiling fan clicked rhythmically, lazily cutting through the thick summer air. The kitchen was barely more than a closet, and the furniture had been scavenged from Craigslist and alleyways, but to Amara it felt like home because it was theirs. She stood barefoot on the cracked linoleum, stirring a pot with one hand and balancing her phone on her shoulder with the other, listening to an automated message about a late payment. Her dark curls were pinned back with a chipped plastic clip, and sweat glistened on her brow, but she smiled anyway. Because tonight, Jonathan was coming home early. He had called to say he'd gotten an email, a response from a venture capital firm. He sounded excited. She wanted dinner ready, wanted everything to feel warm and good when he walked through the door. Jonathan had always been full of dreams. When she met him, he was a wiry, pale young man in thrift store jeans, squatting at a library computer for hours, furiously typing line after line of code. He had been building something, always building. They met at a community tech event where Amara was volunteering, helping set up tables and hand out coffee. He had spilled half a cup on her shirt. She remembered the awkward apology, the frantic napkins, and the spark in his eyes when they talked afterward. He told her then that he was going to create something that changed lives. Not an app to sell things, not a game, but something real, something people needed. She didn't understand most of the technical details, but she understood the passion. And more than anything, she saw someone who believed in something the way she wished she could believe in herself. Amara, at 24, had learned to survive, but not to dream. She had aged out of the foster care system at 18, and had spent the last 6 years scraping by, working as a hotel cleaner, sometimes picking up night shifts at a diner when rent loomed. Trust didn't come easily to her. But Jonathan had a way of talking that made you believe. He didn't see her as someone broken or used up. He saw her as a partner, as his future. They moved in together just 6 months later, sharing a tiny studio in a rundown part of Chicago where the radiators hissed and the walls were too thin to allow secrets. She cooked, he coded, she worked, he pitched. And they clung to each other through every bounced check, every rejection letter, every night spent with her massaging his temples when another investor turned him down. "We're starting from nothing," he used to whisper to her at night, his fingers tracing circles on her back. "But together we'll rise. Together we'll make something beautiful." And she believed him. Not just because she wanted to, but because she had seen him fight. Because he had held her hand through her own quiet breakdowns, had stayed up with her during her flu when she couldn't afford a doctor, had learned how she liked her tea and when to leave her alone. In the beginning, there was balance. He brought ideas. She brought stability. He had vision. She had endurance. And somewhere in the space between their struggles, they built love. Not the grand, sweeping kind from the movies, but the solid, real kind, forged in shared grocery lists and long walks with only enough money for one sandwich. When Jonathan's app finally started gaining traction, it felt like a miracle. It wasn't flashy or viral. It helped small businesses track customer orders more efficiently. But it worked, and people paid for it. A few at first, then more. A local tech incubator took notice. He got invited to pitch in front of investors. Suddenly, emails weren't going ignored anymore. There were meetings, handshakes, promises. With each small success, Amara cheered louder than anyone. She bought him a new shirt from a discount store for his first investor meeting. She stayed up late formatting his pitch deck. She took on extra shifts so he could afford a newer laptop. And when he got that first real check from a seed investor who saw potential in his code and fire, she cried in the bathroom so he wouldn't see how terrified she was that everything would change. It did change. First, it was the office. A shared space downtown, all glass and exposed brick. Then came the assistant. Then the upgraded wardrobe, the personal trainer, the invitations to mixers with tech elites. Amara didn't mind at first. She was proud. Proud of what he'd become, what they had built together. But as the company grew, so did the distance between them. Jonathan came home later. He stopped talking about his day. He stopped asking about hers. Their dinners together became rare, their nights shorter. His phone always buzzing, always vibrating with something that couldn't wait. Then there was the silence. Not angry silence. Not the kind where people fight, but the worst kind. The kind where you become invisible to the person you love. Where your words bounce off them like mist against glass. Amara tried to rationalize it. He was stressed. He was building an empire. She didn't want to nag, didn't want to be that woman. But she noticed the changes, the subtle shifts, the way he flinched when she touched his arm in front of his new colleagues, the way he introduced her at parties. "This is Amara. She helped me get started." As if she were some distant footnote, not the woman who had sewn the first threads of his dream into fabric. When she told him she was pregnant, his eyes went blank. They were in the kitchen. He had just come back from San Francisco. He was wearing a tailored blazer that looked like it cost more than their first month's rent. She had made lasagna. He didn't touch it. "I'm pregnant," she had said, her voice shaking. "We're going to have a baby." He stared at her like she had spoken in another language, then nodded, slowly, said nothing. For days after, he said nothing. She tried to be patient. She reminded herself that he needed time, but deep down, fear began to coil in her chest like smoke before fire. He started working later. He started traveling more. And then came Belinda. Amara had met her once at a company event. Blonde, elegant, Ivy League, the kind of woman who wore stilettos effortlessly and smiled without showing her teeth. She called Amara sweet and asked if she enjoyed staying home. Amara had felt her stomach twist. Jonathan swore she was just an assistant. "Don't be ridiculous," he said, laughing. "She organizes meetings." But one night, when Jonathan came home smelling of expensive perfume and lies, Amara didn't ask. She simply stood at the window, one hand on her stomach, the other gripping the curtain so tightly her knuckles turned white. She still believed, foolishly, that love could fix it. That if she just stayed steady, if she just loved hard enough, long enough, he would come back to her. Then came the day he didn't. It was a Friday. Rain soaked the city. She had folded tiny onesies all morning, humming to herself. She thought maybe they could talk that evening. Maybe start fresh. Instead, Jonathan walked in, his face unreadable, and told her he wanted a clean break. "I've met someone else," he said. "Someone who fits the life I'm building." She stood in silence, watching the man she had loved unravel everything they had. He packed a suitcase for her, left it by the door. "I'll have the lawyer send you something," he said. She left that night with a backpack, her unborn child, and the crushing weight of betrayal digging into her spine like a knife. As she stood on the curb, the rain turning her thin coat into soaked paper, she turned one last time to look at the building they had once called home. she whispered to the child inside her belly, her voice raw but steady. They may have thrown us away, but we will rise again. Then she walked into the dark, one hand on her womb, the other clutching a future she would build from nothing but grit, tears, and the quiet fire of survival. The rain had not stopped that night. It fell in sheets, slicing through the city like needles from the sky, soaking every sidewalk, every soul who wandered without shelter. Amara's thin coat clung to her body like a second skin, offering no warmth, no protection, just a reminder of how much she had lost. She stood at the corner of Clark and 22nd, her fingers wrapped tightly around the straps of the backpack that now held all her earthly possessions: a change of clothes, a worn Bible, a pack of crackers, and a wrinkled ultrasound image she refused to part with. Her belly, swollen with the weight of 7 months' promise, ached under the strain of walking for hours. Cars passed, their headlights momentarily illuminating her before fading into the black. She knocked on the doors of 2 cheap motels only to be turned away. No ID, no cash, no room. One receptionist didn't even look her in the eye. Another stared at her belly and muttered something under his breath before slamming the glass partition shut. She wandered into a laundromat that had stayed open late, hoping for a corner to sit in. The buzz of fluorescent lights hummed above her, mingling with the rhythm of machines tumbling someone else's clean clothes. She sat near a vending machine, clutching her belly, feeling the occasional flutter of life inside. A small kick, a turn, as if her baby was reminding her, "I'm still here. We're still together." That was the only thing that kept her upright. It wasn't until near dawn, when the air turned colder and the sidewalks emptied of the last party-goers, that she found herself sitting on the stoop of a building that looked too old to still be in use. The windows were boarded up, graffiti covered the walls, but the overhang shielded her from the rain, and that alone made it a sanctuary. She lowered herself slowly, mindful of the pain in her lower back, and leaned her head against the door. Sleep came in broken snatches, filled with the distant sound of sirens and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. When morning came, gray and heavy, she knew she couldn't stay there. She stood, stretched her aching body, and kept walking. For 2 days, she survived on crackers and the kindness of a few strangers who gave her a bottle of water or a sandwich without asking too many questions. On the 3rd day, her feet swollen and blistered, she collapsed in front of a corner market near a bus terminal. A woman came out, older, dark-skinned, her face weathered but her eyes sharp with something fierce and maternal. She knelt beside Amara without hesitation. "Child," the woman said, her voice carrying both warning and compassion, "you look like the streets have swallowed you." Amara tried to sit up, but her legs trembled. "I'm fine," she whispered hoarsely. The woman shook her head. "No, you're not. You're carrying a baby. You need food, rest, and someone who knows what she's doing." Her name was Gloria Benson, though she insisted on being called Mama G. She lived in a small one-bedroom apartment above the market, where she worked part-time as a cashier and full-time as a problem solver for the neighborhood's forgotten. She took Amara upstairs, made her tea, and offered her a peanut butter sandwich with a solemn warning. "If you're lying or running from something dangerous, I'll find out. But you're safe tonight." Amara cried as she ate, the first hot tears she had allowed herself since Jonathan's betrayal. That night, she slept in a borrowed t-shirt on a faded couch, with a thin quilt covering her and a cracked fan turning above her. And when she woke the next morning, sunlight pooling through the window, she felt for the first time in days like she might survive. Mama G didn't ask for details, but she paid attention. She took Amara to the public health clinic down the street and stayed with her during the checkup. The nurse said her blood pressure was high and that the baby was large for gestational age. Amara nodded, memorizing every instruction, determined not to let her body fail the life inside her. She spent the following weeks helping Mama G around the apartment, sweeping, folding laundry, cooking simple meals. In return, Mama G let her stay on the couch, no questions asked. There was no talk of rent, only quiet companionship and firm rules. Clean up after yourself, don't lie, and always give back when you can. On a humid Tuesday evening, as thunderstorms rolled in, Amara went into labor. Mama G acted quickly, calling a local doula and boiling towels, the way she had seen her own grandmother do back in Mississippi. The baby came fast, too fast, and Amara screamed into a pillow, gripping the couch cushion with one hand and Mama G's arm with the other. When it was over, she held a crying, slippery boy against her chest, her face drenched in sweat and wonder. "He's here," she whispered, as if still unsure if it was real. Mama G smiled. "You did that. You brought him here? What's his name?" Amara looked down at her son. His skin was a soft brown, darker than hers, with a full head of curls and a quiet strength in the way he blinked up at the light. "Jalen," she said, the name tasting like a promise. "Jalen means thankful, and I am." Those early days were the hardest. Amara's body ached in places she hadn't known existed. She struggled to nurse, cried when the baby wouldn't sleep, panicked when he cried too long. But she rose every morning. She warmed formula when her milk ran out, changed diapers with trembling hands, and wrapped her son to her chest in a sling Mama G fashioned from an old bedsheet. She took her first job cleaning bathrooms at a local gym. The hours were early, but it meant she could be home before noon. In the afternoons, she washed laundry in the bathtub, folded flyers for a delivery service, and kept a notebook where she wrote down every penny she earned and spent. Jalen grew fast. By 6 months, he was crawling, his laughter infectious, his eyes bright. Amara lived for those moments, when he giggled, when he wrapped his tiny fingers around hers, when he fell asleep against her chest, his breath soft and steady. She didn't speak of Jonathan. Not to Mama G, not to Jalen, not even to herself. But at night, when the apartment was quiet and her muscles screamed for rest, she would sometimes touch her belly and remember the girl who once stood in a high-rise kitchen, holding baby clothes, believing in a future that had vanished like steam from a kettle. It wasn't bitterness that drove her. It was hunger. Not for revenge, but for stability, for dignity, for a life where she wouldn't have to choose between diapers and dinner. One evening, while scrubbing the counter in a sandwich shop where she had picked up an evening shift, Amara overheard 2 customers complaining about the local takeout options. "Everything's fried," one said. "No flavor, no care. I just want something real." That night, Amara lay awake thinking about stews from her childhood, recipes whispered from one generation to the next. She thought about plantains, okra, jollof rice, and spiced beans. The next day, she made a small pot and brought it to the shop in a thermos. The manager tasted it, eyes widening, and asked her to make more the next day. Within a week, he let her cook a few dishes from home on slow nights. Customers loved them. They asked for more. She started packaging leftovers and selling them to the gym regulars from her morning job. Word spread. "That girl can cook," they said. Food with soul. Amara started dreaming again, not in bursts, but in small steps. She priced out rice and lentils in bulk. She bought second-hand Tupperware. She made a flyer in Microsoft Word at the library and started taking orders for lunch deliveries to offices nearby. Each container she sold was another step forward. And with every dollar earned, with every meal delivered, she told herself, this is how we climb. Not through shortcuts, not through someone else's pity, but through work, through grit, through the hands that had once been told they weren't good enough to hold anything worth keeping. Amara held her son. She held her future, and she held her place in the world, one breath at a time. By the time Jalen was 1 year old, Amara had already transformed her life in ways she never imagined possible. The girl who had once cried in a laundromat, praying for shelter, had become a woman with calloused hands, a sharpened mind, and an iron resolve. The days were still long, the money still tight, but the small cracks of light that had first peeked through the darkness were widening. Opportunity, once a distant mirage, had begun to take shape, and Amara was chasing it with everything she had. Her lunch delivery venture was no longer a side hustle. It had grown into something tangible, something steady. Every morning before the sun rose, she cooked in Mama G's small kitchen, filling pots with fragrant yolof rice, seasoned stews, and fried plantains. The scent of ginger, onions, and tomatoes hung in the air like a silent promise. Jalen, strapped securely to her back in a wrap, often gurgled in delight at the clatter of pots and the rhythm of her footsteps. He had become a part of her routine, her little partner in this journey. Once the meals were packed into neat containers, Amara would begin her rounds. With her baby on her back and a crate of warm food in her arms, she visited local offices, barber shops, mechanic garages, and construction sites. Her customers were mostly working-class folks, people who appreciated a hot, homemade lunch over bland takeout. They called her the food lady, or Mama with the good rice, and some even started placing standing weekly orders. They smiled when they saw her coming. Some gave her tips. A few became friends. Still, the path was far from easy. There were days when deliveries were late because a bus broke down, or because Jalen had a fever and wouldn't stop crying. There were weeks when food spoiled because she miscalculated portions, or a customer forgot to pay. And yet, she pressed on. Failure no longer had the power to scare her. It had already tried to break her and failed. Amara took detailed notes in a journal she kept tucked in her bag. She tracked customer feedback, adjusted her seasoning, experimented with menu items. She read books from the public library on small business management, customer service, and marketing. At night, after Jalen was asleep and Mama G had gone to bed, she'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, sketching out budgets and delivery schedules by the light of a cheap desk lamp. Mama G watched all this with a quiet pride. Though she rarely said it aloud, she had come to see Amara as the daughter she never had. She taught her how to negotiate with vendors, where to buy the freshest produce at the best prices, and when to stand her ground with difficult customers. "You're not just selling food," she'd often remind Amara. "You're building trust. People come back for what makes them feel human." Jalen grew fast. By 18 months, he was walking, his curious fingers constantly exploring drawers, shoes, pots, and piles of papers. Amara child-proofed what she could and let him roam, often stopping her work to lift him onto her lap and kiss his cheeks. He had a deep, belly-laughing giggle that could melt away the worst of her worries. His first words weren't mama or dada, but rice and go. He was a child born of movement, of hustle, of perseverance. She often said to herself that he had inherited her backbone and his father's stubbornness, though she rarely allowed herself to think about Jonathan for long. Jonathan's name never passed her lips. She never showed Jalen the faded ultrasound picture she kept folded between the pages of her Bible, the one with the word love scrawled across the top in marker, Jonathan's handwriting from the day they found out they were expecting. That moment, frozen in time, had become too painful to hold. Instead, she focused on what lay ahead. One day, after dropping off meals at a downtown office, a receptionist asked if Amara had a business card. Embarrassed, Amara said no. That evening, she went to the library and designed a simple card using a free template. The next day, she printed 50 copies at a local print shop with the little she had saved. They were plain white, with her name, phone number, and the words, Amara's Home Kitchen. Authentic, homemade, heartfelt. Within 2 weeks, she had over a dozen new clients. Encouraged, Amara began to think about expansion. She couldn't keep cooking from Mama G's kitchen forever. It wasn't licensed for commercial use, and the strain on their electricity and plumbing had started to show. When she brought it up hesitantly over dinner, Mama G simply nodded. "I was wondering when you'd ask," she said, pushing a worn envelope across the table. Inside was a flyer from the city's small business grant program. "Apply," Mama G said. "You've earned the right to dream bigger." It took weeks to gather the required documents: proof of income, business plan, references. She wrote late into the night, polishing every line, making sure it captured not just her goals, but her journey. When she submitted the application, she felt a mix of nausea and hope. She told herself she wouldn't think about it again. She had too much work to do. Jalen started daycare shortly after. Amara was nervous. He had never been away from her for more than a few hours. The first day, she packed his favorite blanket and a little note with a heart. He clung to her leg and cried when she left. She sat on the curb outside the building for 30 minutes afterward, crying too. But when she picked him up later, he was smiling, holding hands with another child. "You're raising a boy with roots and wings," Mama G told her that night. "Strong enough to stay grounded, brave enough to fly." Then came the call that changed everything. "Congratulations," said the voice on the other end of the line. "Your application has been approved. You've been selected for a startup grant of $15,000. Amara sank to the floor, tears flooding her eyes. She covered her mouth with her hand to keep from sobbing aloud. 15,000. It felt like 10 million. With Mama G's help, she found a small kitchen space for rent in a converted warehouse. It had industrial appliances, storage, and room to grow. She signed the lease with trembling hands and spent the first night scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. She hired her first employee, a single mother named Renee who had been laid off from a catering job and was desperate to provide for her own son. Together, they created a rhythm. Cooking, packaging, delivering. Amara built a website, launched a basic online order system, and even started an Instagram page with photos of her dishes and short stories about the recipes. Jalen would visit the kitchen after daycare, pulling up a stool to help stir or stack containers. Customers loved seeing him. One regular brought him picture books. Another taught him how to say thank you in Spanish. The kitchen, once a symbol of survival, had become a haven, a place where food, community, and healing came together. Still, the work was relentless. Holidays were the busiest times. Amara spent many Thanksgiving mornings cooking instead of resting. On Jalen's third birthday, she fell asleep at the table during his party. He woke her with a kiss and said, "You tired, Mama? I help." He was always helping. even when he didn't realize it. His presence reminded her of why she kept pushing, why she refused to settle. On nights when exhaustion threatened to pull her under, Amara would sit by his bed, watch his chest rise and fall, and whisper promises. She promised to protect him, to teach him, to build a world where he never had to wonder if he was enough. Years passed. Slowly, steadily, Amara built a reputation. Her food wasn't just delicious, it told a story. Her clients came not just for the taste, but for the feeling. The sense that someone had poured love into every spoonful. Her kitchen earned praise in a local newspaper. Orders tripled. She took on a second employee, then a third. Jalen started kindergarten. At parent-teacher conferences, Amara was told he was bright, focused, and deeply empathetic. He once gave his snack to another child who had none. "He's a natural leader," his teacher said, "very mature for his age." Amara smiled, her boy. She never forgot where they had started. She never let the growing success make her forget the nights on the sidewalk, the borrowed couch, the mornings when oatmeal was a luxury. She kept a photo of her first food delivery, just a single container in a plastic bag on the wall of her office. Underneath, she had written, "Day 1, never forget." What began as survival had become purpose, and what began as heartbreak had blossomed into a life filled with meaning. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. She had built something real, and she had done it with her own hands, her own faith, her own fire. And as Jalen grew, watching, learning, becoming, she saw in his eyes the reflection of everything she had overcome, and everything she would one day pass on. While Amara's world was slowly blooming into something she could be proud of, a very different transformation was unraveling on the opposite side of the city. Jonathan Hartley, once the bright star of Chicago's tech startup scene, had become a man living on borrowed time and borrowed image. The office that had once pulsed with innovation and ambition now sat quiet behind floor-to-ceiling windows, the staff reduced to a skeletal crew, and the buzz of productivity replaced by whispers of concern. But Jonathan, still clinging to the illusion of invincibility, refused to see the cracks forming beneath his feet. After Amara had walked away from his life, no, not walked, been pushed, he had thrown himself head first into his newfound world. With the grace of investment and the fire of hunger, he had grown his startup into a company worth millions on paper. The product worked, the numbers soared, and investors lined up. He moved into a high-rise penthouse, replaced his compact car with a sleek black Tesla, and began attending every gala and networking event within reach. The man who once lived on instant noodles now had a wine cellar curated by a sommelier. Belinda, the secretary-turned-girlfriend, slid easily into the role of socialite. She wore designer gowns with practiced elegance, smiled with practiced warmth, and adapted to every room they entered. She introduced Jonathan to her father, Richard Dane, a man who had built his fortune on real estate and backroom deals, and who viewed Jonathan's tech empire as an interesting, if risky, experiment. At first, Richard dismissed him. A flashy coder, he called him, but Belinda was persuasive, both to Jonathan and to her father. She painted Jonathan as a vision worth backing, a disruptor, a new mind in an old money town. Richard listened, and when Jonathan, desperate to reach the next level, suggested a joint venture, technology for smarter real estate logistics, Richard agreed. That partnership was the beginning of Jonathan's descent, though he would not recognize it for many months. With Belinda managing his calendar and whispering encouragement into his ear, Jonathan signed contracts with barely a glance. The promises were glossy, the money flowed, and the champagne never stopped bubbling. But behind the scenes, Belinda and Richard were consolidating control. Belinda changed the passwords to key company accounts. She redirected billing structures. She quietly hired accountants loyal only to her father. Jonathan, drunk on praise and blind to betrayal, was too busy basking in his own myth to notice. He believed he was the genius behind it all, the one pulling the strings. In truth, he was becoming a marionette in someone else's game. His staff began to shift. Those who questioned too much were quietly let go. Those who flattered him remained. The company's culture, once vibrant with late-night brainstorming and shared pizza, soured into something cold and transactional. Jonathan told himself it was just growing pains. He reminded himself that success came at a cost. He never stopped to ask what it was costing him. Belinda's affections grew cooler with each month. She traveled more, citing business. She stopped joining him at events, claiming exhaustion or scheduling conflicts. When she was home, she spent her time in separate rooms, always glued to her laptop or on hushed phone calls. Jonathan noticed, but buried the discomfort beneath luxury. He bought her jewelry, took her to Aspen, even hinted at engagement. She smiled and said all the right things, but her eyes no longer held warmth. When the company received a surprise audit from the IRS, Jonathan laughed it off. Routine, he told his CFO, but the look on the man's face told a different story. A week later, the CFO resigned. Jonathan convinced himself it was personal. He never asked for the exit memo. Then came the investor meeting. Jonathan walked in wearing a $1,000 suit, prepared to dazzle. Instead, he was greeted with tense silence. One of the major investors, an old friend from the incubator days, slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents he'd never seen, or rather never noticed. Misappropriated funds, falsified invoices, offshore transfers, transactions that bore his digital signature. "You need to explain this," the investor said flatly, "because we're pulling out unless you can convince us you're not about to collapse." Jonathan stammered, confused, defensive. He accused hackers, mistakes, glitches. But nothing he said changed the stone-cold facts on paper. The board froze his access. Lawyers were brought in, and Belinda, she disappeared that night. Her phone off, her email deactivated, her desk cleared. When he returned to the penthouse, most of her belongings were gone. On the marble kitchen counter sat a manila envelope addressed to him. Inside was a brief note. "Don't look for me. You knew the game when you joined it. I just played it better." Attached was a copy of the final transfer receipt. She had drained their joint accounts. Every penny. The days that followed were a blur of headlines, subpoenas, and cold betrayal. The press tore into him. The investors sued him. The Justice Department opened an inquiry. Jonathan, once praised as a genius, was now mocked as a fraud. The charges mounted. Though Richard Dane's name was nowhere to be found in the investigation, those who paid attention understood exactly how it had been orchestrated. Jonathan had been useful. Until he wasn't. The trial was swift. His lawyers negotiated a plea deal. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison for wire fraud and embezzlement, with possible parole after 2. When he arrived at the federal facility, there were no reporters, no goodbye parties, no friends offering support. Just a uniform, a number, and a bunk. Prison stripped him down. The silence was deafening. His cell was cold, the food bland, the faces around him indifferent. At first, he blamed everyone else. Belinda, Richard, the investors, even Amara. But over time, as the routines dulled his defenses, he began to see the rot that had started within him long before the collapse. He remembered the day he had told Amara to leave, how her eyes had searched his face for a reason, a crack in the mask, some trace of the man she had once believed in. He had given her none. He remembered the baby, his child, a boy, maybe, or a girl. He had never asked, never cared. In his quest to build a kingdom, he had cast aside the very foundation of it. He thought of Amara often, wondered if she had survived, if she had remarried, if the baby had been born healthy. The silence of those thoughts haunted him more than the prison bars. He wrote a letter once to Amara, apologizing, rambling, never sent it. He didn't know where to send it, and part of him knew he had no right to ask for forgiveness. When he was finally released, the world had moved on without him. He had no money, no property, no company, no allies. His name was a footnote in tech articles about cautionary tales. He found a bed at a halfway house and worked night shifts at a warehouse loading trucks. The work was hard, the hours brutal, but he was too tired to complain. He kept his head down and mouth shut. Sometimes, while eating a cold sandwich during his break, he'd imagine what life might have been if he had stayed with Amara, if he had chosen love over ambition, if he had seen her for what she truly was, a foundation, not a flaw. He wondered if his child had grown up kind, smart, if they knew his name, if they hated it. But mostly, he wondered if it was too late to start over. One rainy afternoon, while walking past a strip of small businesses on the south side, Jonathan noticed a line forming outside a cozy corner restaurant. The sign above read, "Golden Flavor." The air was rich with spices, and the people in line laughed with a familiarity. He didn't know it yet, but fate had finally begun to circle back. And in the soft hum of the city, the quiet churning of pots, and the name Amara spoken in reverence by those in the line, something old inside him stirred. Not hope, not yet, but a reckoning. Jonathan Hartley wandered through the world like a ghost, the weight of silence and failure clinging to him like a second skin. He had no mirror to check, but he felt the years in his bones, in the way people passed him without recognition, as if he had already disappeared. On paper, he was 52, but his body moved like it belonged to a man 20 years older. Every ache in his knees, every twinge in his back was a reminder of the time lost, of choices made without understanding their true cost. His days were simple now. Work the night shift at a cold distribution center, sleep a few hours in the noisy halfway house, repeat. The world that had once applauded his brilliance had long since moved on, and in its place remained only empty headlines and whispered warnings. Don't be like him. He had stopped counting the days since his release. Nothing about his life was measured anymore, except the exact number of dollars and cents he had in his pocket. It wasn't just humility that filled him, it was hunger. Not for food, but for meaning, for any trace of the man he had once been before ambition devoured his soul. He often found himself walking unfamiliar streets during his brief moments off, scanning restaurants and shops he would never enter, watching families laugh on park benches, observing strangers as if their happiness might spill onto him by proximity. He never stayed in one place too long, wary of being noticed or remembered. It was during one of these wanderings that he saw it. Golden Flavor, nestled on the corner of a quiet, busy street, with a facade of warm brick, windows fogged by steam, and a line of customers that wrapped halfway around the block. The smell hit him before the sign did. Smoke, spice, sweetness, and with it came something deeper, something so familiar it made his chest tighten. He stopped in his tracks, stared for a long moment. Then he moved on. He didn't go inside that day, nor the next, but he began passing it more frequently, changing his walking route so that it became part of his daily rhythm. He watched, always from a distance. He saw women in aprons step in and out, calling to one another, carrying trays, laughing. He saw men in suits taking calls while waiting in line, children licking sauce from their fingers, delivery drivers hurrying in and out. It was the kind of place that pulsed with life. What he didn't see, what he never expected, was that inside that building, behind the counter, under the glow of warm kitchen lights and surrounded by the comfort and rhythm of pots and pans, stood the woman he had once cast aside. Amara. Her hands, once cracked and bruised from cleaning hotel rooms, now orchestrated her own empire, each movement confident and precise. Her face, aged gently by time and tempered by hardship, carried lines of resilience instead of bitterness. She was not the ghost of his past. She was the fire he had tried to snuff out and failed. And beside her, often helping behind the register, standing tall with the easy charisma of someone born into love and discipline, was a young man with skin the color of deep bronze, a strong jawline, and thoughtful, intelligent eyes that watched the world with quiet observation. His name was Jalen, and he was 24. Jalen had become the kind of man people noticed, not because he demanded attention, but because he carried himself with dignity. He was known in the community not only as Amara's son, but as someone who had a head for numbers and a heart for service. After excelling in high school, he had received a full scholarship to one of Chicago's top universities, studying engineering and finance. He had graduated at the top of his class, his name spoken with pride by professors and classmates alike. Instead of immediately accepting one of the lucrative job offers thrown his way, he chose to work part-time while helping his mother expand the business they had built together. By the time he was 22, Jalen had launched his own consulting startup focused on helping small businesses streamline operations, with a particular emphasis on underserved communities. He became a speaker at local entrepreneur workshops, a mentor to neighborhood teens, and a quiet leader whose success came without arrogance. And yet, despite everything he had achieved, he remained rooted to the kitchen that had given him his first lessons in integrity and effort. He never forgot the nights he slept in a crib in the corner while his mother filled takeout orders. He never forgot the sacrifices or the silent strength that had raised him. To Jalen, his mother was the blueprint. She had taught him that love was not performance, but commitment. That family wasn't defined by names on a birth certificate, but by who showed up when it mattered. About his father, she had said little, only that he had chosen a different path, that he had walked away, and that what they had built alone. Jalen didn't press for more. He didn't need to. He had lived the absence, felt it like a hollow echo in rooms where a father should have been. But he had never allowed it to define him. He had made a promise to himself. He would be the kind of man he had once longed for, steady, present, accountable. It was a Thursday afternoon when Jalen first noticed the older man hovering near the edge of the crowd outside the restaurant. The man's clothes were worn, his face partially obscured by the hood of a faded jacket, but there was something in his stance that caught Jalen's eye, a kind of nervous longing, a hunger not just for food, but for place. Jalen didn't recognize the man, not consciously, but something in his gut whispered that this was more than a random passerby. The next day, the man returned. Jalen saw him again, standing by the lamppost watching the front door like a dog waiting for permission to approach. Jalen walked outside, carrying a bag of leftover food meant for donation, and as he turned to place it on the curb for pickup, the man looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, the world froze. Jonathan saw it instantly. Those eyes. His own mirrored in the face of a stranger who was not a stranger. He had imagined this meeting so many times, crafted speeches in the quiet corners of his mind, but none of those fantasies had prepared him for the real thing. The boy, no, the man, standing before him was his son, his, the life he had abandoned, the legacy he had tried to forget. Jalen felt something twist in his stomach, sharp and undeniable. He didn't know who this man was, but his presence struck him like déjà vu wrapped in unease. "Sir," Jalen said, his voice calm, "are you looking for someone?" Jonathan's throat closed. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then, hoarsely, he whispered, "I was just hungry." Jalen nodded slowly. "We have extra meals. Come in, you can eat." Jonathan followed him inside. The warmth of the restaurant hit him like a memory, the sounds of laughter, clinking dishes, and music weaving together in a tapestry of life. He didn't look toward the kitchen, didn't dare. He sat quietly at a corner table as Jalen placed a plate in front of him. Jollof, rice, spiced chicken, sautéed greens. "Thank you," Jonathan said. Jalen offered a polite nod and turned away. But Amara had seen him. She had emerged from the back room to grab a set of clean towels when her eyes landed on the man sitting alone. Her breath caught. The years fell away. There he was. The man who had once stood in their kitchen and told her she wasn't enough. The man who had thrown her out into the rain with their unborn child inside her. For a moment, the weight of the years, the victories and scars, all balanced on the edge of her silence. Then Jalen returned. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice low. "I think he's been watching the place." Amara looked at her son, then back at the man who had disappeared from her life. "That," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "is your father." Jalen stared at her, unblinking. Then he turned to look at the man again. The similarities hit him like a slap. The jawline, the eyes, the shape of his hands. He stood frozen for a long moment, trying to process the weight of a name he had never been given. When he approached the table, Jonathan looked up, hope flickering behind tired eyes. Jonathan started. Jalen raised a hand. "No, you don't get to speak yet." Jonathan's mouth closed. "I'm not here for a reunion," Jalen said, his voice shaken with something deeper than anger. "You left before I took my first breath. You let her walk away carrying me, and you never looked back." "I didn't know how," Jonathan whispered. Jalen leaned in. "She never badmouthed you, never poisoned me against you, but you didn't have to be a villain to be a void. You were just absent." He stepped back. "Finish your meal, then leave." Jonathan didn't argue. He sat in silence, eating slowly, trying not to cry. Amara watched from behind the counter, her expression unreadable. That night, as the city lights flickered and the last customer left, Jalen sat across from his mother in the now quiet restaurant. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. "Because your life wasn't missing anything," Amara said. "You were never defined by his absence. You were shaped by love." Jalen nodded, but the scar was there now, visible. The next day, he walked the city alone, thinking not about the man he had met, but about the man he was becoming. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want reconciliation. But he did want peace. And sometimes that started with a boundary, not a bridge. For 3 days after the confrontation in the restaurant, Jalen walked with a weight he didn't know how to name. It wasn't grief. His life had never included his father in any meaningful way, and it wasn't rage either. He had imagined that moment so many times as a child, wondering what he might say if ever given the chance, but none of those imagined speeches had come true. In the end, all he had delivered was truth, flat and direct, not for impact but for clarity. And yet, something remained unsettled inside him, a gnawing tension that pulsed quietly beneath every moment of his day. He hadn't spoken to Jonathan again after that afternoon. When Jalen had returned to the restaurant the next morning, there had been no sign of him. No crumpled jacket at the door, no lingering eyes in the crowd, just the regular flow of life. Customers came and went, orders were placed, dishes were served, the scent of simmering sauce filled the air. And yet, for Jalen, nothing felt routine. Amara watched her son closely during those days, letting him process without interference. She knew that silence was often louder than words. He wasn't angry with her, he'd made that clear, but she could see something had cracked open inside him. For 24 years, she had carried the weight of being both mother and father. She had worked to ensure Jalen never felt less than whole, and in many ways she had succeeded. But now, the presence of the man who had walked away, just when Jalen had never expected to see him, had introduced a new fracture. On the third evening, Jalen came home later than usual. He sat at the dining table, still in his work clothes, a folder tucked under his arm. Amara was chopping onions in the kitchen, and the sound of the knife echoed softly through the room. "I went looking for him," Jalen said quietly. Amara didn't stop chopping, but she turned slightly, waiting. "He wasn't easy to find. I checked the shelter network, looked at a few food kitchens. A woman at a drop-in center on 83rd said she recognized him. Said he's been sleeping outside near the old post office, trying to stay out of sight." Amara set the knife down and wiped her hands on a towel. She came to the table and sat across from him. Jalen opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a printout with a logo at the top and a name beneath it. "It's a program," he explained. "They work with formerly incarcerated men, help them find housing, jobs, therapy. I've worked with them before. We did a grant for them last year. They're good people." Amara looked at the paper, then at her son. "You think he deserves that?" Jalen shook his head. "I don't think he deserves anything, but I think I do. I think I deserve to be free of him, really free. And that means closing the door the right way, not slamming it and walking away, not letting his absence control the room. Just doing what needs to be done, with dignity." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "That's strength, Jalen. Not many would call it that, but I do." The next morning, Jalen returned to the corner where he had last seen his father. The sky was low and overcast, a chill biting the air. He spotted the hunched figure tucked into the doorway of a shuttered bookstore, knees drawn to his chest, hands trembling as he tried to light a cigarette. Jalen approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. Jonathan looked up, startled. He blinked once, twice, as if not sure the figure before him was real. "I brought you something," Jalen said, holding out the paper. Jonathan didn't move. "It's a place," Jalen continued. "They help people like you, people trying to start over. There's a contact name and a number. If you go today, they'll have a bed for you tonight. After that, it's up to you." Jonathan stared at the paper. His lips parted, but no words came. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with fatigue and shame. Jalen knelt down and placed the paper beside him. Then, after a long pause, he said, "I forgive you." The words were quiet, almost casual, but they hung in the air like a storm about to break. Not because you earned it, Jalen added, but because I'm not carrying you with me anymore. Jonathan's breath hitched. He looked away, eyes glistening. Jalen stood. Whatever you do next, it's yours. I'm done needing anything from you. He walked away, not looking back. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Jonathan made his way across the city to the address on the paper. It took him over an hour. His legs slow, his heart heavier than the wind that fought against him. The building was nondescript, a pale brick structure with chipped paint and a faded awning. But the woman at the desk greeted him with kindness, and for the first time in years he slept indoors without fear. Meanwhile, life at Golden Flavor continued to unfold with rhythm and joy. The restaurant was thriving. 3 locations now, each staffed with people who believed in the mission as much as in the food. Amara had stepped into a leadership role that transcended the kitchen. She gave talks at community centers, appeared on panels for women entrepreneurs, and mentored young mothers trying to find their way. She had taken everything that once threatened to destroy her and transformed it into purpose. Jalen continued to grow his consulting firm, building a reputation not just for business acumen, but for integrity. He married a woman named Amina, a teacher with a laugh like summer and a heart as sharp as his mother's. They had 2 children, bright, curious, full of questions. Every Sunday, the family gathered at Amara's house for dinner. Mama G, now in her 80s, still sat at the head of the table, telling stories and teasing Jalen about his picky eating as a boy. Laughter filled the rooms. Photographs lined the walls. The table was always full. 5 years passed. On a warm spring evening, as the city came alive with the sounds of music and clinking glass, Golden Flavor's flagship location hosted a family dinner, as they often did on Sundays. Jalen sat at the table, his daughter on his lap, his son next to him drawing superheroes on a napkin. Amina chatted with Amara about opening a tutoring program in one of the restaurant's back rooms. The smell of grilled fish and spices floated through the air. Everyone was at ease. Jonathan was not there. He had completed the program Jalen sent him to, had secured a job as a night guard at a storage facility, and had found a small apartment near the river. He kept mostly to himself. He wrote letters to Jalen once a year, brief notes with updates about work and health. Jalen read them but rarely responded. There was no reunion, no miraculous healing, just distance. Peaceful, intentional. And that, Jalen realized, was enough. Forgiveness had never been about rekindling something lost. It had been about claiming space for his own future. About stepping out from under the shadow of a man who had left and refusing to let that absence be the defining note of his life. As the meal drew to a close, Jalen raised a glass of juice and clinked it gently against his daughter's sippy cup. He looked around the table, taking in the people who had built this life with him. His wife, his mother, his children, the family that had shown up and stayed. Not one of them had been a part of the plan his father once made, but every single one of them was part of the life Jalen had chosen. Amara caught his eye and smiled, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. He knew what she was thinking because he felt it too. They had made it. Not perfectly, not without scars, but completely. And in that completeness there was peace. Sunday evenings at Golden Flavor had become a ritual. The long table in the back room was always set early. Mismatched dishes, hand-folded napkins, and pitchers of homemade hibiscus tea glinting under soft lights. The kitchen hummed with quiet purpose, and the laughter of children echoed off the tile floors, blending with the rhythmic clatter of spoons and serving trays. It was a space full of stories, but none louder than the one that had started with a girl on a rainy street. carrying nothing but her unborn child and the weight of betrayal. Amara moved through the restaurant with an ease that spoke of ownership not just over the space but over her own story. Her hair, streaked now with hints of silver, was tied back in a patterned wrap, and the smile she wore was no longer forced or fragile. It was earned. She greeted customers like family, remembered the names of babies and grandparents alike, and still tasted every new dish before it was added to the menu. What she had built with her hands and her heart, and it showed in every corner of her business. She had 3 restaurants now, each one rooted in neighborhoods often forgotten by developers and chain franchises. She hired local. She trained with patience. She gave second chances to people who had heard no too many times. Golden Flavor was more than a name. It was a reflection of her life's work, to nourish, to uplift, and to give warmth where there had once been cold. Jalen, now nearing 30, was a partner in every way. He still ran his consulting firm, now with employees and contracts in multiple states, but he remained closely tied to the business that had shaped him. He had taken over financial operations for the restaurants, implemented systems that helped them thrive, and helped expand their catering services to schools, hospitals, and events. At home, he was a husband, a father, and a man fully comfortable in the life he had chosen. His children adored Amara. His daughter, Casey, loved to sit in the kitchen and ask questions about recipes, while his son, Malik, had recently taken to setting napkins at the tables every Sunday, insisting that it was his very important job. Amina, Jalen's wife, continued teaching but also led literacy workshops in partnership with the restaurant's community programs. Their family was woven into the fabric of the business, and that connection brought with it a sense of purpose none of them took for granted. As they gathered around the table one Sunday, plates piled high with jollof, rice, plantains, and roasted vegetables, Amara sat back and took it all in. The air was filled with the sound of people who belonged to one another, laughing, teasing, clinking glasses. Mama G, now in her late 80s, still presided at the head of the table, her stories slightly slower but her wit as sharp as ever. She had become something of a legend in their circle, a matriarch with a heart big enough to house the dreams of everyone she'd ever helped. There was no empty chair set for Jonathan, no waiting or wondering if he would appear. That part of the story had closed with a quiet finality. He still sent letters once a year, and Jalen, as before, acknowledged them only with a brief message or none at all. Amara read the letters when Jalen offered them to her. She saw in them a man trying to wrestle with his past, trying to find some shape of redemption in a life he had dismantled with his own hands. But she also knew that redemption wasn't something she could hand him. It was something he had to build for himself, and whether or not he did, it no longer touched her peace. She didn't wish him harm. She didn't wish him anything at all. And that was the gift. The freedom to no longer feel tethered to what he had done. After dinner, the children helped clear the plates, and Jalen joined his mother on the front porch of the restaurant, where 2 old rocking chairs had been placed beneath hanging lanterns. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the late evening traffic drift by, the sky above streaked in lavender and gold. "You know," Jalen said, "sometimes I still think about him. Not often, but it creeps up, not in anger, just curiosity." Amara nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "That makes sense," she replied. "He's a part of your beginning. That doesn't vanish, but you didn't let him shape your middle or your end." Jalen leaned back, listening to the distant murmur of city sounds. "I'm glad I met him, though, he said, not because I needed him, but because I needed to know I didn't. Amara smiled. That's a powerful thing to realize. He turned toward her. I used to think strength was about proving him wrong, about rising so far above that he'd regret everything. And now? Now I know strength is building something so good that his absence doesn't even register. She reached over and took his hand. That was always the goal. Not revenge, just healing. He nodded. You gave me that, without even trying. The next morning, Amara stood alone in the kitchen before opening hours, prepping ingredients with practiced hands. She moved slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of reverence. This space, once just a dream whispered into late-night silence, was now a living testament to everything she had endured and overcome. She thought about her younger self, the girl who had stood in the rain, shivering, humiliated, cast aside by a man who had promised forever. She thought about the terror of labor in a stranger's apartment, the first time she sold food from a crate, the first time Jalen called her Mama and clung to her neck like she was his whole world. She thought about how far they had come, not through miracles, but through moments. One good decision at a time. One act of faith in the face of fear. One refusal to let bitterness take root. Her story, she knew, would never be perfect. It wasn't tied up in neat bows or Hollywood reunions. Jonathan would never be a grandfather to her grandchildren. He would remain a shadow on the edge of their lives, a presence acknowledged but not invited. And that was okay, because this family, this life, this business built on honesty and love and unyielding courage was enough. It was more than enough. Later that week, Jalen gave a keynote speech at a business summit focused on ethical entrepreneurship. He spoke of numbers, market trends, and strategies, but he ended with a story. His story. He told them about a woman who had nothing, who had been told she was worth even less, and who had built everything from grit and love. He didn't mention her name, but everyone in the audience could feel her in his words. He spoke not as a son burdened by the past, but as a man illuminated by legacy. When he finished, the room rose to its feet, and Amara, watching from the back row, clapped not because he had spoken well, but because he had spoken true. That was her real success. Not the restaurants, not the revenue, but the son who stood whole before the world and called himself free. She would carry that joy with her forever. Because in the end, the story she had written was not one of revenge or tragedy. It was a story of love, of quiet strength, and of choosing every day to rise. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to discover another powerful journey, and don't forget